"Hey, mister, I need your help. $1 is all I've got." $1. That was the weight of the crumpled bill pressed into a small, trembling palm. As the toddler in the white dress stood at the entrance of the city's quietest traditional garden, her eyes remained locked on the man the entire underworld spoke of in terrified whispers. She had seen the ink-dark tattoos peeking from his collar in grainy news photos, knew the stories of his dragon reputation, and knew he was a man most grown men wouldn't dare to look at, let alone approach. The afternoon sun shimmered through the cherry blossoms, casting dappled, golden light across the stone-paved paths. Nearby, the sound of a trickling koi pond offered a rhythmic peace that felt out of place in a city so full of noise. Min-jun sat in the center of it all on a low stone bench, his white shirt crisp and stark against the dark ink that climbed his forearms. A shadow moved behind him, his bodyguard, a silent sentinel in a sharp suit, but the real protection was the invisible aura of absolute authority that radiated from Min-jun himself. It was a shield that kept the world at a respectful, fearful distance. "Identify the fear and own it," he had once told his lieutenants, a cold philosophy that had allowed him to seize control of the district's fractured territories. But today, the philosophy felt heavy. This was his 1 hour of required stillness, a monthly ritual where he stepped away from the ledgers of debt and the weight of life-and-death decisions. Overhead, a lone hawk circled the sky, its sharp cry echoing over the park as families began to gather their things to leave before the gates closed. Min-jun glanced at his watch, a minimalist platinum piece that cost more than most family homes, and wondered how much longer he could keep the mask of the boss from slipping. For years, this garden had been his neutral ground, a place where the constant chess match of power was put on hold. Here, surrounded by the simple lives of strangers, he could briefly imagine the man he might have been if the streets hadn't claimed him. He watched a father help his daughter fly a kite, a small, mundane joy his own life had never afforded. The sudden ache of that realization was interrupted when he felt the invisible shield around him break. A tiny figure in a white dress and a bright pink sash was hovering at the edge of his vision, clutching a single dollar like it was a lifeline. "Hello, friends and family, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comment section so I can send you special regards. And also, hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel." The golden light of the afternoon seemed to avoid the small patch of stone where Min-jun sat, as if even the sun gave him a wide berth. He leaned back against the cool surface of the bench, his fingers tracing the faint, jagged scar on his palm that predated his tattoos, a souvenir from a time when he fought for scraps of bread instead of city blocks. He had built his empire on the ruins of his own mercy, learning early that in the concrete labyrinth of the district, one was either the architect of their own survival or the rubble beneath someone else's feet. Every inch of his current power had been bought with blood and a calculated coldness that had slowly become his only skin. He watched the dragon inked across his right forearm, its tail disappearing under the cuff of his white shirt. To the men who worked for him, that dragon was a symbol of an iron will. To the enemies who had tried to usurp him, it was a death warrant. But here, in the hushed sanctuary of the gardens, the ink felt heavy, like a suit of armor he couldn't quite strip off. He breathed in the scent of damp earth and pine, trying to find the man who had once loved the sound of rain before he learned to use the storm as a distraction for his soldiers. Across the garden, hidden behind the thick trunk of a weeping willow, Tiana felt her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her small fingers were locked tight around the single dollar bill, the paper soft and velvety from the countless times she had unfolded and refolded it in the dark of her bedroom. She had spent 3 weeks watching the black cars from her window, timing the arrivals and departures of the man with the quiet eyes. She had heard the neighbors whisper that he was a monster, a shadow that ate other shadows, but Tiana had seen the way the local bullies scattered when his car merely turned the corner. To her, he wasn't a monster. He was the only thing bigger than the fear that lived in her house. She took a step forward, her patent leather shoes clicking softly against the stone. The sound felt like a gunshot in the tranquil air. She saw the man in the dark suit, the one who always stood behind the bench, straight in his posture, his hand moving slightly toward the lapel of his jacket. Tiana froze. The world seemed to hold its breath. She thought of her mother, whose voice was becoming a ghost of itself, and the way the man who came to their door every Friday night would laugh while he took the grocery money. That memory was the final push she needed. Minjun didn't move his head, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere. The shield had been breached by something small, something that didn't carry the jagged edge of an assassin or the frantic energy of a beggar. He looked up, his gaze meeting the wide, dark eyes of the girl in the white dress. She was a vision of purity that didn't belong in his world of gray deals and blacker intentions. He saw the way she clutched her pink sash, her knuckles white, her tiny frame vibrating with a courage that was clearly costing her everything. He didn't signal his bodyguard to intervene. Instead, he watched her approach, intrigued by the absence of the typical flinch he saw in most adults. As she drew closer, the contrast became stark, his world of iron and ink versus her world of ribbons and hope. He realized then that while he had built his empire from nothing to ensure no one could ever hurt him again, this child was risking her entire existence just to stand in his shadow. The predator was, for the first time in a decade, completely captivated by the prey. Tiana stopped exactly 3 feet away, the distance she had practiced in her head. She didn't look at the tattoos or the bodyguard. She looked straight into Minjun's eyes, seeing not a dragon, but a man who looked very, very tired. Slowly, she extended her hand, offering the crumpled dollar as if it were a king's ransom. "I need a contract," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the trickle of the koi pond, yet it carried the weight of a decree. Minjun stared at the bill, then back at the girl, and in that moment, the empire he had built from nothing felt strangely small compared to the singular dollar in her hand. The dollar bill sat in Tiana's palm, a small, wrinkled scrap of paper that looked utterly insignificant against the backdrop of the high-stakes world Minjun commanded. Yet the air between them grew heavy, the silence of the garden stretching thin like a wire about to snap. Minjun's bodyguard took a half-step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion, but a single, infinitesimal tilt of Minjun's head froze him in place. The dragon of the district was not offended, he was mesmerized. Minjun looked at the dollar, then up at the small face framed by a perfectly straight pink bow. He didn't reach for the money yet. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his tattooed forearms on his knees, bringing his gaze level with hers. To any other soul in the city, this proximity would be a death sentence, but Tiana didn't flinch. She simply waited, her breathing shallow but her stance unshakable. "A contract," Minjun repeated, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. "That is a very serious word for someone so small. Do you know what my contracts usually cost, little one?" Tiana nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. "I know people pay you in gold and favors. I know they pay you because they are afraid." She paused, her voice trembling just enough to show she wasn't fearless, only determined. "But I'm not paying you to be afraid of you. I'm paying you to be the one the other person is afraid of." A ghost of a smile touched Minjun's lips, a rare, dangerous expression that never reached his eyes. "And who is this person that deserves my attention for a single dollar?" "Mr. Henderson," she said, the name tasting like poison. "He comes when the sun goes down. He tells my mama that the house isn't ours anymore. He takes the money she saves for her medicine, and he says if she tells the police, he'll make sure my sister and I go to a place where the lights never stay on." She stepped closer, the patent leather of her shoes scuffing the stone. "He thinks he's the biggest monster in the neighborhood. But I heard the men at the corner store say that even the monsters bow to the dragon." Minjun felt a cold, familiar anger stir in his chest, not at the girl, but at the amateur cruelty of a man like Henderson. He dealt in power, in territorial wars, and in blood debts, but there was a specific brand of cowardice in preying on the sick and the small that he had never tolerated. He looked at the dollar again. It represented every penny this child had likely ever touched. It was a week's worth of lunch money, a month's worth of treats, or perhaps a year's worth of tooth fairy visits. "You think $1 is enough to buy my time?" Minjun asked, his tone shifting into something more clinical, testing the girl's resolve. "My men don't move for less than thousands. My influence is not a toy." Tiana didn't blink. "It's not just $1, it's all I have. If I give you everything I have, then the contract is fair. That's what Mama says, that the value isn't in the number, but in what you give up to offer it." She reached out further, the bill hovering inches from his inked hand. "Mr. Henderson only wants what we have. I want him to go away forever. I want him to be so scared of you that he forgets we even exist." Minjun looked at the girl's eyes and saw a reflection of a younger version of himself, a boy who had once stood in the rain, wishing for a giant to step out of the shadows and crush the people who hurt him. He had become that giant, but in the process, he had forgotten that giants could do more than just destroy. They could protect. Slowly, with a deliberate grace that made his bodyguard's eyes widen in shock, Min-jun reached out. His large, calloused fingers, stained with the history of 1,000 battles, gently took the crumpled dollar from Tiana's tiny hand. He smoothed it out against his thigh, treating the ragged paper with the same respect he would a high court treaty. "The logic of a predator," Min-jun murmured, more to himself than to her. "You went to the top of the food chain to handle a scavenger." He looked her squarely in the eye, his expression hardening into the mask of the boss once more, but this time the mask was a shield for her. "The contract is accepted, Tiana. You have paid in full." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a crisp, new $100 bill. He didn't hand it to her as a gift, but as a change. Every contract has a fee, but every businessman knows when a client has overpaid. Consider this a refund on the interest. Tiana looked at the large bill, then back at him, her lip wobbling for the first time. The weight of the world seemed to lift off her small shoulders so suddenly that she stumbled back a half step. "Will he go away?" Min-jun stood up, his full height casting a long, imposing shadow that swallowed the space where Tiana stood. He tucked her single dollar into his breast pocket, right against his heart. "Mr. Henderson is about to find out that there is always someone bigger," Min-jun said, his voice dropping to a temperature that would have turned the koi pond to ice. "Go home, Tiana. Tell your mother that your house is now under the protection of the dragon, and tell her the rent has already been settled." Tiana gave a small, breathless "thank you" and turned, her white dress fluttering as she ran toward the garden gates, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Min-jun watched her until she was nothing more than a speck of white against the darkening city. He turned to his bodyguard, the smile completely gone, replaced by a gaze that made the seasoned soldier break into a cold sweat. "Find out everything about this Henderson. I want to know where he breathes, where he sleeps, and who he thinks he is to touch what belongs to my client." The bodyguard nodded, already reaching for his phone. "And the girl, sir?" Min-jun touched the pocket where the crumpled dollar sat. "The girl just gave me the first honest day's pay I've earned in a decade. Make sure she gets home safe. Then we go to work." The garden was still bathed in the amber glow of twilight when Min-jun stood, the small, wrinkled dollar bill now tucked safely into his breast pocket. To the world, he was the dragon of the district, a man whose empire was built on ironclad contracts and the absolute removal of obstacles. To Tiana, he was a guardian bought for a single coin. He intended to honor that transaction with the same clinical precision he applied to international shipping routes or territorial disputes. As he walked toward the sleek black sedan idling at the park's edge, his bodyguard, Di-hyun, fell into step a precise 2 paces behind. The tranquil atmosphere of the koi pond was replaced by the low hum of the vehicle's engine and the muffled clicks of high-end communication devices. The transition from the sanctuary back to the machine was seamless. Min-jun didn't wait to be seated before he began the operation. "I want everything on a man named Henderson," Min-jun said, his voice cutting through the interior of the car like a blade. "He's a scavenger operating in the residential blocks near the old shipyard. He's leaning on a family, a woman with a chronic illness and 2 young daughters. Find the leverage he's using. Find the debts he claims they owe, and find where he keeps his records." Di-hyun nodded, his fingers already dancing across a tablet. In the world of Min-jun's organization, information was the primary currency. Within minutes, the machine was in motion. In a windowless room miles away, analysts began pulling property records, utility histories, and digital footprints. The shadow of the Mafia didn't just move with guns and muscle, it moved with data, weaving through the city's infrastructure like a ghost in the wires. By the time the car reached the upper levels of his high-rise headquarters, the first file was ready. Min-jun stepped into his office, a space defined by glass and cold, minimalist stone. He didn't look at the sprawling city skyline. Instead, he looked at the grainy image projected onto the wall. Marcus Henderson, a small-time opportunist with a history of predatory lending and a string of unfortunate evictions. He was exactly what Tiana had described, a man who thought he was a giant because he only stepped on those who couldn't stand up. "He's using a fraudulent deed transfer," Min-jun said, his voice cutting through the interior of the car like a blade. "Find the leverage he's using. Find the debts he claims they owe, and find where he keeps his records." Hyun reported, pointing to a highlighted section of a legal document on the screen. He targeted Tiana's mother, Catherine, knowing her medical bills were piling up. He forced her to sign a temporary management agreement that he's twisted into a full surrender of the property. He's been pocketing her disability checks as rent and threatening her with CPS if she speaks up. Min-jun felt a cold, sharp disgust. In his world, there were rules. You fought those who knew the game. You broke those who chose to enter the ring. But Henderson was a parasite, feeding on the vulnerability of a child's hope and a mother's pain. The dragon didn't just see a target, he saw an insult to the order he maintained. He operates out of a backroom office in a defunct laundromat on 4th Street, Hyun continued, swiping to a map that showed the scavenger's daily routine. He has 2 enforcers, ex-cons with more muscle than sense. They'll be at the house tonight to collect what he calls a convenience fee. Min-jun walked to the window, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the city lights. He reached up and touched the pocket where the dollar bill lay. He thought of the pink sash and the way the girl hadn't blinked when facing his tattoos. She had given him her everything to buy his shadow. "No local police," Min-jun ordered, "and no noisy entrances. I want Henderson to feel the walls closing in before he even sees the ceiling fall. Have the technical team freeze his accounts. Every cent he took from that family is to be flagged as fraudulent. Prepare the documents to nullify that deed transfer. We aren't just scaring him away, Hyun. We are erasing his ability to exist in this district." As the night deepened, the Mafia's shadow stretched across the neighborhood. Unmarked vans parked at the corners of Henderson Street. Silent observers watched from the rooftops, their long-range lenses capturing every move the predator made. Henderson was currently at a local bar, laughing and tossing back cheap whiskey with his cronies, unaware that the machine had already mapped his life and was systematically dismantling it. Min-jun sat at his desk, watching the live feed of the family's modest home. He saw the lights go out in the small bedroom where Tiana lived. She was sleeping, likely for the first time in weeks, believing in the contract she had signed with a monster. "The hunt begins at midnight," Min-jun whispered to the empty room. The predator had been identified, the files were complete, and the dragon was hungry. Henderson had spent his life preying on the weak, but tonight, he was about to learn that he had accidentally invited the apex predator into his own backyard. The dollar bill was on the table, and the Mafia was ready to collect. The moon was a sharp, silver sliver over the shipyard district, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rusted corrugated metal of the old laundromat on 4th Street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale detergent and cheap tobacco. Marcus Henderson sat at a scarred wooden desk, a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a stack of pilfered disability checks in the other. He was grinning, the expression of a man who believed the world was a banquet and he was the only one with a fork. He didn't hear the hum of the black SUVs pulling up to the curb, nor did he notice when the streetlights at both ends of the block simultaneously flickered and died. The final delivery was not an act of chaos. It was a masterpiece of clinical efficiency. Min-jun's men moved with the synchronized grace of a shadow falling across a room. Hyun led the team, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. They didn't break down the doors with shouting and gunfire. Instead, the locks clicked open under the touch of electronic bypass tools, and the hinges breathed a silent sigh as the team slipped inside. Henderson's 2 enforcers, stationed by the back loading dock, didn't even have time to reach for the weapons tucked into their waistbands. One moment they were joking about their next collection, and the next, the world went dark as they were pressed into the brick wall with the terrifying speed of practiced professionals. No words were exchanged. There was only the muffled sound of struggle, the zip of heavy-duty restraints, and the absolute finality of being outmatched. In the back office, Henderson finally felt the shift in the air, a sudden, freezing drop in the room's temperature. He looked up, his grin faltering as he saw the door to his sanctuary swing open. He expected to see his men, perhaps looking for their cut. Instead, he saw Hyun, flanked by 2 figures whose presence felt like a physical weight against his chest. "Who the hell are you?" Henderson stammered, his hand instinctively moving toward the drawer where he kept a snub-nosed revolver. "Don't," Hyun said, the single word carrying the force of a gavel. Henderson's hand froze. Hyun walked forward with a measured, rhythmic stride and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the desk, right on top of the stolen checks. Mr. Henderson, you've recently entered into a contract with a very important client. Unfortunately, your performance has been unsatisfactory. Henderson's eyes darted to the folder. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any partners. You do now, Hyun replied, his voice devoid of emotion. You have been found in possession of property and funds belonging to the Brooks family. You have used intimidation to coerce a woman in medical distress. In this district, that is considered a breach of the peace, and the dragon does not like his peace disturbed. The color drained from Henderson's face at the mention of the name. The local myths he had dismissed as ghost stories were suddenly standing in his office, wearing tailored suits and carrying the scent of expensive cologne and imminent doom. One of the men stepped forward and turned a laptop toward Henderson. On the screen, a digital ledger was rapidly deleting entries. As of 3 minutes ago, Hyun explained, your shell companies have been liquidated. Your bank accounts have been flagged for federal fraud investigation. The deed you forced Catherine Brooks to sign has been digitally annulled, and the original is currently being reduced to ash. You can't do this, Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. That's my livelihood. Your livelihood was built on the terror of a 9-year-old girl, Hyun countered, his eyes flashing with a rare, sharp spark of anger. That was your first mistake. Your second was believing that your insignificance would protect you from the dragon's notice. Hyun leaned down, his face inches from Henderson's. You have 2 choices. You can stay in the city and wait for the police to arrive and process the very detailed files we've left for them. Files that include 10 years of your tax evasion and racketeering. Or, you can take the bus ticket my associate is currently placing on your desk. It's a one-way trip to a place very far from here. If you are ever seen within 300 miles of this district again, the next delivery won't involve a conversation. Henderson looked at the bus ticket, then at the silent, predatory men surrounding him. He realized that his power had been an illusion, a paper castle built in the path of a hurricane. He reached out with a trembling hand and took the ticket. The checks, Hyun prompted. Henderson pushed the stack of disability checks across the desk as if they were burning his skin. Hyun gathered them up, sliding them into a clean white envelope. The exit was as quiet as the entry. Within 10 minutes, the laundromat was empty, the black SUVs had vanished into the city's nocturnal arteries, and the streetlights hummed back to life. Marcus Henderson was gone, a phantom erased from the neighborhood's memory before the sun could even rise. Back at the headquarters, Min-jun sat in his darkened office, looking out at the sprawling tapestry of the city. The door opened softly, and Hyun entered, placing the white envelope on the desk. The threat has been neutralized, sir, Hyun reported. Henderson has fled. The family's legal standing is restored. They are safe. Min-jun picked up the envelope, his thumb tracing the edge. He didn't feel the triumph of a conqueror. He felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally balanced a ledger that had been skewed for a long time. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the crumpled $1 bill Tiana had given him. He placed it on top of the envelope. This was the most expensive contract I've ever taken, Hyun, Min-jun said softly, his gaze fixed on the humble bill. Because for the first time, I wasn't paid to take something away. I was paid to give something back. He stood up, the light of the city reflecting in his dark, tired eyes. The final delivery is complete, but the guardianship, that is only just beginning. Make sure the medical specialists are ready for the mother, and find out which school Tiana wants to attend. Our client deserves the best. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, the dragon sat back down, not as a hunter, but as a silent watchman. The contract was fulfilled, but the story of the girl in the white dress and the man with the dragon tattoos was far from over. The weeks following Henderson's disappearance were unusually quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But for Tiana and her mother, Catherine, the silence wasn't predatory. It was peaceful. The heavy, rhythmic pounding on their front door had ceased, and the threatening letters in the mailbox had been replaced by the simple, mundane arrival of utility bills. However, the greatest shadow still loomed, the slow, agonizing decline of Catherine's health. It was a Tuesday morning. the kind where the air felt thick with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, when the first miracle arrived. It didn't come with fanfare or a black sedan. It arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the seal of the university's Neurological Institute. Catherine sat at the small kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she slit the paper open. Tiana watched from the hallway, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the quality of the paper. It looked exactly like the stationery in the office of the man with the tattoos. As Catherine read the letter, the color drained from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, bewildered hope. The letter explained that she had been randomly selected for a fully funded experimental medical trial targeting her specific autoimmune condition. The trial covered everything: cutting-edge infusions, specialized physical therapy, and even a monthly stipend for nutritional support. It was a program that, by all rights, should have had a waiting list miles long and a price tag that would have required a second mortgage. "Tiana," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at her daughter. "They say it's a gift from a private foundation. They say they've been tracking my case through the public clinic's records. It says I start on Monday." Tiana walked over and hugged her mother's waist, burying her face in the floral fabric of her apron. She didn't say a word about the botanical garden or the dollar bill. She knew that in the world of the dragon, the best gifts were the ones that appeared to be the work of fate. Minjun's machine was no longer dismantling a life. It was meticulously rebuilding one, piece by agonizing piece. The transition was immediate and clinical. On Monday, a specialized transport service arrived, not a flashy car, but a professional silver medical van that looked perfectly legitimate to the neighbors' prying eyes. At the Institute, Catherine wasn't treated like a charity case. She was met by Dr. Eris, a world-renowned specialist who spoke to her with a level of respect and optimism she hadn't experienced in years. Behind the scenes, the foundation was a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts managed by Minjun's most trusted accountants. Every specialist, every vial of medication, and every hour of therapy was paid for with the same ruthless efficiency that once funded territorial expansions. But Minjun had given Di-Hyun a very specific instruction. The mother must never feel the weight of the debt. She must believe her own body's resilience is the hero of this story. By the end of the first month, the change was visible. The gray pallor of Catherine's skin had been replaced by a faint, healthy glow. The cane she had leaned on so heavily began to spend more time leaning against the wall. For Tiana, the miracle wasn't just the medicine. It was seeing her mother laugh again while standing at the stove, no longer tethered to the couch by the gravity of pain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Tiana looked out her bedroom window. A familiar black car slowed to a crawl at the end of the block. It didn't stop, and no one got out, but the tinted glass reflected the street lamp like a watchful eye. Tiana touched the glass and whispered a silent thank you into the cool air. She knew the $1 contract was being honored in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The monsters were gone, the medicine was working, and the fear that had once lived in the corners of their home had been evicted. But as she watched the car disappear into the night, Tiana realized that the man with the tattoos wasn't just fixing their present, he was clearing a path for their future. The first miracle was life, but she sensed that the dragon had even larger designs for the girl who was brave enough to buy his soul for $1. The neighborhood where Tiana lived had always been a place of sharp edges and sudden movements, but as the months passed, the atmosphere shifted into something unnervingly still. The predatory figures that used to loiter on the street corners, eyeing every passerby for weakness, had migrated to other districts. A strange, silent perimeter had been established, and though most residents attributed it to a random change in police patrols, Tiana knew better. She felt the weight of the invisible shield every time she walked to the local library or the grocery store. It was the ghost of the black car. It was never the same vehicle, yet the energy it radiated was unmistakable. Sometimes it was a sleek charcoal sedan idling near the bus stop. Other times, it was a heavy, tinted SUV parked at the edge of the school playground. It never stayed long enough for the neighbors to grow suspicious, but it was always there when Tiana felt the slightest prickle of unease. If a group of rowdy teenagers got too close to her on the sidewalk, the car's engine would give a low, predatory growl, and the boys would suddenly find a reason to be elsewhere. It was a guardianship that was felt rather than seen, a shadow that guarded the light. For Tiana, the car became a companion. She started making it a game, spotting the dragon's eyes in the rearview mirrors of parked cars or the reflection of the glass storefronts. She felt a profound sense of safety that no fence or lock could provide. But with that safety came a growing curiosity. She remembered the man on the stone bench, the way he had looked at her dollar bill as if it were a holy relic. She wondered if he was still sitting in that garden, or if he was trapped in the cold, high-rise towers of the city, surrounded by the men in suits she saw on the news. One evening, the ritual changed. Usually the car would move on as soon as Tiana reached her front porch. But tonight, as she stood on the top step, the black sedan remained stationary. The driver's side window slid down just an inch, revealing only a pair of dark sunglasses and a sharp jawline. It wasn't Min-jun, but it was one of his. A hand emerged from the gap, holding a small white envelope. There was no name on it, just a single hand-drawn dragon curled around a tiny 1. Tiana walked down the steps, her heart racing not with fear, but with a strange sense of belonging. She took the envelope, and as her fingers brushed the paper, the window slid back up, and the car pulled away with a whisper of tires against asphalt. Inside the envelope was a card for a prestigious private academy, the kind of place where the gates were made of wrought iron and the students went on to become doctors and presidents. There was also a small, polished stone, a deep onyx that felt warm in her hand. She took the stone to her room and sat by the window. She realized that Min-jun wasn't just watching her, he was studying her. He knew she liked the stars, so the school he chose had an observatory. He knew her mother was getting stronger, so the school was on a direct bus line from the new medical center. Every coincidence in her life was a calculated move in a grander game. The Mafia boss was using the same, strategic and efficient machinery that ran a criminal empire to curate the childhood of a single girl. As the weeks turned into months, the presence of the car became more than just protection. It became a promise. Tiana began to excel in her studies, no longer distracted by the sounds of shouting in the hallway or the fear of an empty refrigerator. Her mother, Catherine, was now walking without a cane, her laughter filling the house like music. Catherine often marveled at their luck, calling it a streak of divine favor, but Tiana would just smile and touch the onyx stone in her pocket. She understood now that the dollar bill hadn't just bought a hit on a neighborhood bully. It had bought an architect. Min-jun was building a fortress around them, not made of stone, but of opportunity and silence. The ghost of the black car was the reminder that even in a world of monsters, a single act of bravery could turn the apex predator into a sentry. One night, the black car didn't just pass by. It stopped, and for the first time since the garden, the rear door opened. It wasn't an abduction, it was an invitation. Tiana looked back at her house, where her mother was peacefully reading a book, and then at the dark interior of the car. She knew the contract was evolving. The $1 was the beginning, but the journey of the girl and the dragon was about to enter its next phase. She stepped toward the car, ready to ask the one question that had been burning in her mind. Why? The car door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing out the sounds of the neighborhood and replacing them with the scent of sandalwood and old leather. Tiana sat on the edge of the plush seat, her feet barely reaching the floorboards. Across from her, shrouded in the dim, amber light of the cabin, sat Min-jun. He looked exactly as he had in the garden, impeccable, composed, and carrying the weight of a kingdom in the stillness of his posture. The tattoos on his hands were visible as he rested them on his knees, the dragon's scales catching the glint of the passing streetlights. For a long moment, the only sound was the low hum of the tires on the pavement. Min-jun did not speak first. He gave her the space to find her voice, a courtesy he rarely extended to the kings and kingmakers he usually dealt with. Tiana looked at him, her gaze traveling from the sharp line of his suit to the tired, human depth in his eyes. "You did everything I asked," Tiana said, her voice small but steady. "Mr. Henderson is gone. My mama is getting better. I have a school with a library that smells like old books." She paused, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. "But the contract was only for $1. My teacher said $1 only buys a candy bar. So why are you still here? Why do you keep giving us miracles?" Min-jun shifted slightly, the movement fluid and predatory, yet his expression softened. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, clear acrylic frame. Inside was the same crumpled, salt-stained dollar bill Tiana had handed him months ago. He held it up, the humble paper appearing surreal in the luxury of the limousine. "In my world, Tiana, value is a complicated thing," Minjun began, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "Men come to me with millions, begging for my favor. They offer properties, secrets, and blood. But they always offer those things because they want to gain something more. Their money is loud, and it is dirty with greed." He looked at the dollar bill, his thumb brushing the edge of the frame. "You didn't come to me to gain. You came to save. You offered me the entirety of your world, every cent you possessed, without knowing if I would strike you down for the intrusion." He leaned forward, the shadows of the city dancing across his face. "When a man like me gives his word, it is the only thing he truly owns. Most people think I own the buildings in this district or the ships in the harbor, but those can be taken by fire or law. My word, however, is absolute. When I accepted this dollar, I didn't just accept a payment. I gave a promise to a child who was brave enough to see a man where everyone else saw a monster." Tiana watched him, trying to grasp the gravity of his words. "So, I didn't overpay." "You paid the highest price possible," Minjun replied. "You gave your trust to the untrustworthy. That kind of currency is rare. It bought my interest, yes, but more importantly, it bought my respect. And in my organization, the Dragon's respect is a lifetime contract. I keep helping because I want to see what a person with your courage can become when she isn't spending all her energy being afraid." He reached out and handed her a small, velvet box. Tiana opened it to find a silver lapel pin in the shape of a small, soaring bird. "You asked why I keep giving you miracles. It's because I've spent my life creating shadows. Helping your family is the only thing I've done in 20 years that allows me to look at that dollar bill and not feel like a ghost." The car slowed to a halt back in front of her house. The ghost of the black car had completed its journey for the night. Minjun looked out the window at the warm glow of the Brooks' living room, where Catherine was visible through the sheer curtains, moving gracefully as she set the table. "A dollar bought my word," Minjun whispered, almost to himself. "And my word is the only thing that keeps the dragon at bay." Tiana stepped out of the car, the velvet box clutched to her chest. She realized then that the contract wasn't about the money at all. It was about the exchange of two different kinds of power, her innocence for his protection and his strength for her hope. As the car pulled away, she didn't feel like a client anymore. She felt like a legacy. She walked up the steps, her heart no longer a trapped bird, but something that was learning how to fly. The transition from survival to life didn't happen with a sudden explosion of wealth, but rather through a series of lucky breaks, so well-timed they felt like the universe was finally apologizing to the Brooks family. It began with the house. One afternoon, a professional-looking man in a gray suit arrived at their cramped apartment with news of a community housing relocation project. Due to the previous fraudulent claims on their property and a settlement from a mysterious anonymous trust, Catherine and her daughters were being moved to a quiet, tree-lined street on the edge of the district. The new house was a 3-bedroom bungalow with a wide front porch and a backyard that smelled of fresh-cut grass and jasmine. For Tiana, the miracle wasn't the granite countertops or the modern kitchen. It was the fence. It was high enough to provide privacy, but low enough for her to see the tops of the cherry blossom trees in the distance. In the yard, there was a sturdy oak tree with a tire swing already attached, as if the house had been waiting specifically for a child who had forgotten how to play. As they moved their few belongings into the sun-drenched rooms, Catherine seemed to shed the last remnants of her illness. The medical trials had done more than just stabilize her. They had revitalized her spirit. With the threat of Henderson gone and the burden of rent settled through what the lawyers called perpetual trust credits, Catherine found herself with something she hadn't possessed in a decade: time. She didn't waste it. Inspired by the nurses and doctors who had saved her life, Catherine enrolled in a nearby college to finish the nursing degree she had abandoned years ago. The scholarship that covered her tuition appeared in her student portal overnight, listed simply as a vocational reentry grant. The rhythm of their home changed. The sound of Tiana's heavy, cautious silence was replaced by the scratching of pens as mother and daughter sat at the dining table, doing their homework together. Catherine studied anatomy and pharmacology, her face lit by a desk lamp and a new sense of purpose. Tiana studied the stars and history, her mind expanding far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood that once tried to swallow her whole. Minjun's presence in their lives had become entirely subterranean. He was the foundation they stood upon, but he no longer stood in their way. Occasionally, when Tiana walked home from her new school, she would see a familiar black car parked at a distance. She would touch the silver bird pin on her collar, the one he had given her, and she would see the car's lights flash once, a silent, "I see you" from the dragon. The neighborhood scavengers who had once circled their family like vultures were now long gone, replaced by a sense of community protection that the police could never quite replicate. Delivery drivers, mail carriers, and even the local grocer seemed to treat the Brooks family with a peculiar, quiet reverence. They were the dragon's clients, though no one ever used the words out loud. By the end of the year, Catherine had secured a full-time position at the very institute that had treated her. She wore her scrubs with a pride that brought tears to Tiana's eyes. They were no longer a family defined by what they lacked, but by what they had reclaimed. The $5 contract, or rather, the $1 contract in Tiana's case, had matured into a future that was bright, stable, and profoundly normal. Tiana spent her evenings in the backyard, swinging higher and higher on the tire swing, looking up at the sky. She wasn't looking for monsters anymore. She was looking at the stars, knowing that somewhere in the city, a man with a dragon tattooed on his arm was watching the same sky, holding a crumpled dollar bill that had bought more than he ever thought possible. The seasons had cycled through the city, and the humid, heavy air of the previous year had been replaced by a crisp, clear morning that carried the promise of new beginnings. For Tiana, the world was no longer a place of shadows to be navigated, but a vast landscape to be explored. Standing in the mirrored hallway of their 3-bedroom home, she adjusted the collar of her navy blue school blazer. On the lapel, pinned securely next to her school emblem, was the small silver bird Minjun had given her, a silent talisman of the life she had bought with a single dollar. Her mother, Catherine, stood behind her, smoothing Tiana's hair into a neat bun topped with a familiar pink bow. Catherine looked radiant. The exhaustion that had once defined her face had been replaced by a sharp, intelligent vitality. She was dressed in professional attire, ready to head to the hospital for her shift after the ceremony. They looked like any other successful family heading out to celebrate a milestone, a far cry from the frightened pair that had once hidden behind a locked door from the likes of Marcus Henderson. The ceremony took place in the grand auditorium of the prestigious academy Tiana now called home. The air was filled with the scent of polished wood and the excited hum of parents and faculty. When Tiana's name was called for the Leadership and Resilience Award, the applause was genuine and loud. She walked across the stage with a measured, rhythmic stride, a grace she had unwittingly mirrored from a man she had only met a handful of times. As the principal handed her the certificate, Tiana didn't look at the cameras or her waving mother. Instead, her eyes drifted to the very back of the hall, toward the shadows beneath the mezzanine. There, leaning against the far wall, stood a tall figure in an impeccable white shirt and black trousers. He didn't applaud, and he didn't move, but the light from the stage caught the faint glint of the tattoos on his neck. Minjun stood in his rare moment of anonymity, yet his presence was as commanding as ever. Beside him, Di-Hyun remained a silent sentinel, ensuring the space around the boss remained undisturbed. Minjun's gaze met Tiana's for a split second, a silent acknowledgement that spoke of a contract fulfilled and a promise kept. He offered a nearly imperceptible nod, a king acknowledging a peer. By the time Tiana stepped off the stage and navigated the crowd of congratulatory parents, the space at the back of the hall was empty. The dragon had vanished back into the subterranean world he ruled, leaving no trace of his presence other than the lingering sense of security that now permeated Tiana's life. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of gold and orange, Tiana walked to the edge of the school's garden. A black sedan was idling at the curb. The window slid down just enough for an envelope to be passed through. Tiana took it, but this time, she didn't wait for the car to pull away. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, hand-drawn card. On the front, she had drawn a dragon and a bird flying together. Inside, she had written only 4 words: "The contract is forever." Inside her own envelope, Tiana found a small, clear acrylic block. Encased within it was her original, crumpled $1 bill. On the base of the block, engraved in silver, were the words, "The most valuable investment in the district." Minjun watched from the rearview mirror as the girl in the white dress and pink sash waved to him. He reached up and touched the spot over his heart where he used to carry her payment. He had built an empire from nothing, but he realized now that his greatest legacy wouldn't be the territories he controlled or the fear he inspired. It would be the girl who was no longer afraid. As the car pulled away, merging into the rhythmic flow of the city, Minjun felt